The history of Napoleon Bonaparte usually begins with a calculation error that has survived centuries, and I am not referring to a military strategy, but to his own height. There is this image engraved in the collective unconscious of a tiny man, almost caricatured, compensating for his lack of inches with the conquest of an entire continent. However, the reality is much more mundane. He was 5 feet 6 inches tall. For the time, that was a very standard height, even slightly above the French average. The myth of the little corporal was born in part from the scathing British propaganda, and in part due to a misunderstanding with the French measurement units of the time. But above all, the feeling of shortness came from his surroundings. Napoleon was always escorted by his imperial guard, an elite corps made up of men who looked like giants. Next to those nearly 2-meter-tall grenadiers, anyone would look like a child. But what he lacked in intimidating physical presence, he made up for in an ambition that simply didn't fit maps. Our protagonist was not born in a Parisian palace, but in Ajaccio, Corsica, in 1769. His family was part of a local nobility that had somewhat declined. In fact, Corsica had just been purchased by France from the Republic of Genoa just before he was born. This is key. Napoleon grew up seeing the French as invaders. He was basically a provincial boy with a strong Italian accent who, at 9, was sent to mainland France. Imagine the cultural shock. At Brienne School, he was the center of all the bullying. His classmates, sons of high French aristocracy, laughed at his way of speaking and humble origin. But Napoleon was not one to sink. While the other cadets dedicated themselves to duels and parties, he took refuge in the library. He devoured books on math, geography, and lives of great conquerors. He was an obsessive student who was already designing his own path to the very top. His main engine was meritocracy. You know, that concept that argues power and success should be earned by talent and effort, instead of being received by inheritance or for having an important last name. For a young Corsican without contacts, this concept was his only way to glory in an old world. And then, as if the universe were listening, the French Revolution broke out in 1789. In a France that was sending its aristocrats to the guillotine with terrifying efficiency, the old military hierarchies were blown to pieces. Suddenly, it no longer mattered which family you came from, but how well you could move a battalion. Chaos was his best ally. His first great moment of glory occurred at the Siege of Toulon in 1793. The British had occupied this strategic port, and the French generals were paralyzed. Napoleon, then only a young artillery captain, arrived with a plan that looked more like an equation than a strategy. He convinced his superiors that by taking specific hills and placing cannons there, the English fleet would have to flee. And it worked exactly as he predicted. With surgical precision, he swept away the English and retook the port. It was his first great victory and the stepping stone that made him a brigadier general at only 24. Overnight, the name Bonaparte began to echo in the halls of power in Paris. However, success in revolutionary France was like walking a tightrope over a lion's den. After Robespierre's fall, Napoleon spent a short time in prison due to his political ties and ended up in the capital, ruined and watching as his career seemed to fade away. But luck rescued him again. In October 1795, a royalist mob tried to stage a coup. Paul Barras, a government leader, needed someone who wasn't afraid to pull the trigger. Napoleon accepted the task and wasted no time. He took the cannons to the streets. It was a massacre, but it saved the Republic and earned him a nickname. As a reward for his iron loyalty, he was given command of the Army of Italy. When Napoleon arrived at the headquarters in Italy, he found a heart-wrenching scene. His soldiers were poorly fed, had no shoes, and hadn't been paid in months. But here is where the Napoleon who was a genius of mass psychology emerged. Instead of giving them empty speeches about freedom, he spoke directly to their pride. He promised them honor, glory, and above all, the riches of the Italian cities. In less than a year, this man humbled the most veteran Austrian generals. He moved with a speed that broke all the rules. He always attacked where the enemy was weakest. He conquered northern Italy, sent wagons of gold to Paris, and signed peace treaties. He was no longer a simple soldier. He had become a European political celebrity. But his ambition needed constant feeding. France was too small for him. The strategy was to cut Britain's supply route, but he also wanted to emulate Alexander. He didn't just take cannons. He embarked a legion of scientists, artists, and archaeologists. It was a fascinating expedition. While his soldiers fought, his scientists discovered temples. It was there that the Rosetta Stone was found, the key to deciphering hieroglyphs. However, at sea, the story was quite different. British Admiral Nelson destroyed the French fleet, leaving Napoleon trapped in the desert. Anyone would have panicked, but Napoleon used the time to organize Egypt while sending bulletins to Paris. When he learned that France was in chaos again, he abandoned his army and returned home in secret. Upon landing, people did not see a deserter, but the savior returning to restore order. France was ruled by the Directory, a corrupt and hated system. Napoleon decided it was time to take total control. On the 18th of Brumaire, 1799, he staged a coup with soldiers clearing the Parliament Hall. Thus, the consulate was born, and Napoleon was named first consul. From here, he began a frantic national reconstruction. He created the civil code and reformed education. The country finally had stability, but Napoleon wanted something more. He wanted a dynasty. In 1804, he decided that the world needed to see his power in a crown. The ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral was the most calculated act of self-promotion of all time. Before the event, Notre Dame was imposing and silent, with its altar decorated and empty throne waiting. During the ceremony, Napoleon snatched the crown from Pope Pius VII and placed it on his own head. The final result was a majestic Napoleon sitting on his throne, already crowned Emperor of the French. Having become emperor, he set out to conquer Europe. The monarchs of the old powers allied to bring him down, but in 1805, Napoleon delivered his military masterpiece, the Battle of Austerlitz. With a smaller army, he deceived his enemies and achieved his most brilliant victory. Europe was at his feet. He began to redraw the map, placing his brothers on several thrones. It seemed nothing could stop him, but the empire was so vast he began to lose reality. He was at the top, but on the horizon the first shadows of a winter appeared. The excessive expansion and the continental blockade against England began to create cracks. Napoleon trusted his genius would suffice, ignoring the awakening nationalism in conquered peoples. His blind trust in his own destiny would, in the end, be his greatest weakness. When one feels like the architect of the world, it is easy to ignore that foundations can fail. Napoleon had imposed the continental blockade. This term refers to an economic warfare strategy where France prohibited all trade with Britain, with the hope of ruining their industry and forcing them to sue for peace through pure and total financial suffocation. The problem was that this measure did not only affect the English, it turned all of Europe into a pressure cooker. Port merchants, from the cold Baltic waters to the sunny Mediterranean coasts, were all suffering from the same economic blockade. Napoleon's success the entire their mezig saw their businesses sink, while the black market flourished on every corner, making everyday life much more expensive for everyone. This blockade was what led him to commit one of his most costly strategic mistakes, focusing on the Iberian Peninsula. Portugal, which was a traditional ally of the British and heavily dependent on their trade, firmly refused to close its ports. Portugal decided and Napoleon decided that the simplest solution was to invade the neighboring country by crossing through the heart of Spain. But, since his troops had to cross Spanish territory anyway, The emperor thought it would be an excellent strategic idea to take advantage of the Spanish royal family's decadence and internal fights to gain total control of the entire country. He invited Charles IV and his son Ferdinand VII to a high-level meeting in the French city of Bayonne. And, through a mix of veiled threats and psychological manipulation, he got them both to renounce the throne for him. In his place, he put his older brother, Joseph Bonaparte, whom the Madrilenians soon began to nickname Pepe Botella, for rumors of his supposed alcoholism that were actually more a matter of propaganda than historical reality. Napoleon thought the Spanish people would receive his French enlightened reforms with their arms wide open and full gratitude. But what he received was a popular uprising that began in Madrid on May 2, 1808. And it spread like wildfire through every single town and mountain peak of the entire Iberian Peninsula. It was in Spain where French generals learned the hard way what guerrilla warfare actually meant for an army. This is a concept where small groups of civilian fighters, who are not part of any regular army, perform quick attacks, sabotages, and ambushes against an invading army that is much larger and better organized, taking advantage of their knowledge of the terrain to disappear before the enemy can organize an effective response. Spain became an ulcer that did not stop bleeding men, money, and morale for the entire French Empire. His soldiers, who were accustomed to large and decisive battles fought in wide-open fields, were totally confused, went mad looking for an enemy who was everywhere and nowhere, hidden behind every rock and olive tree. While the situation in Spain became an endless quagmire from which it seemed impossible to escape, Napoleon decided the best way to solve his authority problems was to create an even larger conflict, invading Russia. Tsar Alexander I had decided to ignore the trade blockade against England to save his own national economy. And the emperor could not allow anyone to disrespect him in that way in front of all Europe. In June 1812, he crossed the Niemen with the Grande Armée, a force of over 600,000 men. It was a multinational army, a true Tower of Babel, where French, German, Italian, Polish, and Spanish were spoken. However, Russia was not like the battlefields of Italy or Germany. The physical space was simply infinite. The Russian roads were nothing more than deep paths of thick mud that trapped the heavy French supply wagons. And the Russians proved to be absolute masters of the ruthless and devastating scorched earth military tactic. Basically, this tactic consists of the retreating army destroying absolutely every single resource that could be useful to the invader. They burn the ripe crops, kill all the livestock, and poison the water wells to leave nothing behind, and set fire to entire villages so the enemy finds neither bread nor a roof to shelter from the weather. Napoleon advanced and advanced through a silent desert of ashes where life had been completely wiped out, while hunger and typhus began to claim many more lives than the actual military battles ever did, such as the bloody carnage of Borodino, a battle where nobody truly gained anything but massive piles of corpses. Despite the heavy casualties, Napoleon managed to enter the old Russian capital, but he found a poisoned gift waiting. Initial state. Before the tragedy began, Moscow appeared to French soldiers as an architectural jewel of golden domes, though the absolute silence in its deserted streets was terrifying to the officers who were waiting for formal surrender. Process. During the occupation, the Russian governor ordered saboteurs to set fire to the wooden supply depots. The flames spread with uncontrollable fury due to the winds, lighting up the night sky as the soldiers ran. Trying to put out the fire with insufficient water buckets amidst a whirlwind of sparks and suffocating smoke. Final result. The final result was a city reduced to a black skeleton of coal and smoking rubble, where only the stone walls of the Kremlin stood like an island in a landscape of total, absolute devastation, leaving the French army without any supplies at all to spend the harsh and upcoming Russian winter. Napoleon waited weeks for the Tsar to sue for peace, But the response from St. Petersburg never arrived. With the first snow falling on Moscow's ruins, he had to order the most disastrous retreat in military history. What followed for the Great Army was nothing less than a painful and slow descent into absolute hell. That once glorious army became a column of ragged ghosts walking painfully through the very deep winter snow, constantly harassed by the fierce Cossack charges and by a cold so intense that it literally froze eyelids and caused the soldiers' fingers to fall off completely due to the advanced state of frostbite and necrosis. Men died by the thousands every night around campfires, fighting desperately for pieces of dead horse meat. At the Berezina River, the crossing turned into a carnage under the constant fire of the Russian artillery. Of the initial 600,000 men, barely a few thousand managed to cross back across the border. The long-standing myth of Napoleon's absolute invincibility had finally died frozen in the deep Russian winter snow. Seeing the giant mortally wounded, all European powers joined Britain in the formation of the Sixth Coalition. Napoleon, showing amazing energy, raised a new army of very young recruits known as the Maria Luisas. But at the Battle of Leipzig, he was overcome by numbers and the betrayal of some German allies. In 1814, the Allied forces finally entered Paris, marking the beginning of the end for the emperor's long reign. His own marshals, the men who had become rich and famous under his shadow, turned their backs on him completely. They told him clearly and firmly that they were no longer willing to fight for his lost and crumbling cause. Napoleon, alone and defeated, signed his abdication at the Palace of Fontainebleau before leaving for his new exile, and was sent into exile to the small island of Elba, far away from the power of Paris. He was allowed to keep the title of emperor while governing that small and isolated piece of land. But for someone who had redrawn the map of Europe, Elba was nothing more than a ridiculous and tiny cage. During 10 long months, Napoleon dedicated himself to improving the island by building new roads and local infrastructure and organizing his small court. But his mind and heart remained firmly back in his beloved France. Upon learning that the new king, Louis XVIII, was not popular and faced growing discontent from the French people, and that European powers were fighting at the Congress of Vienna, he decided to play his final card. He escaped from Elba in a small flotilla and landed in the south of France to begin his return, beginning a march toward Paris that today seems legendary, gathering followers and soldiers along the way. The soldiers the king sent to arrest him ended up lowering their rifles in a show of deep loyalty and joining him to the cry of "Long live the Emperor" as they embraced their former leader. Thus began the 100 Days, a brilliant yet tragic epilogue to his incredible and historic military career. Napoleon regained power without firing a single shot, but Europe was not willing to allow his return. The final battle took place in June 1815 at Waterloo, a name that would define his ultimate fate. There, face to face with the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian General Blücher in the mud of Belgium, Napoleon fought his last military chess match on a muddy field that hampered his every move, which made the movement of his heavy artillery almost impossible during the most critical moments of the fight. After mistakes by his subordinates and a heroic resistance by the British infantry squares against the French cavalry, the arrival of the Prussians at the end of the day finally sealed his inevitable and tragic destiny. Napoleon tried to abdicate in favor of his son, but this time the Allies showed no mercy. They took him as far away as possible, to St. Helena, a volcanic rock in the South Atlantic. There he spent his last 6 years, closely guarded by British warships that circled the island constantly, and fighting for his dignity against a British governor who was obsessed with strict rules and regulations. He died in 1821, leaving a legacy that still divides the world to this day. For some, the great modernizer who brought civil law and equality before the law to his people. For others, the bloody conqueror who sacrificed an entire generation for the sake of his own ego. But what no one can possibly deny is that after his long reign, Europe would never be the same again.